Nate Blake had never been the kind of man to chase attention or make noise. After losing his wife 2 years earlier, he moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Greenville, a place that promised peace, routine, and the kind of silence that could hold his grief without judgment. His new property wasn't grand or modern, but it was his. A single-story house with a sloped roof and a yard that stretched far enough to give him breathing space. For months, he poured himself into simple, grounding work, repainting the fence, clearing the garden, planting vegetables. It wasn't about perfection. It was about control, about finding something he could build again with his own hands. When spring arrived, Nate decided to add a small wooden shed near the fence, something practical where he could keep tools, supplies, and the leftover equipment from the life he used to share with his wife. Gardening gloves, a set of brushes, the half-finished birdhouse she had started before getting sick. The shed became a quiet project, something that gave his day structure. He measured the lot carefully, double-checked his survey map, and even consulted the local guidelines before pouring the foundation. For the first time in a long while, he felt steady, productive, almost at peace. That peace lasted exactly 3 days after the shed's completion. On a bright Saturday morning, while Nate was repainting the door, a woman appeared at the end of his driveway. Tall, sharply dressed, her blonde hair wound into an immaculate twist, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She carried a clipboard and a kind of confidence that didn't need permission to enter someone else's property. "Mr. Blake," she called, her tone overly polite, practiced. He set down the paintbrush and wiped his hands. "Yes?" The woman smiled tightly. "Karen Whitfield. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association." She said it like a title rather than a role, the way a judge might announce a verdict. "We've had a few concerns brought to our attention regarding your new structure by the eastern fence." Nate frowned, uncertain where this was going. "You mean the shed?" She nodded briskly. "Yes, that's the one. According to our records and the official community zoning map, that structure is positioned too close to the boundary line. HOA regulations require a minimum setback of 50 feet. Nate blinked, caught between confusion and disbelief. 50 feet? That would put it halfway into my garden. That can't be right. Karen adjusted her sunglasses, glancing toward the fence with the air of someone inspecting an offense. "I'm afraid it is. You'll need to relocate it immediately. Otherwise, the HOA will have to issue a fine." Her tone was cool and professional, but there was something beneath it. A quiet satisfaction, as though she'd been waiting for this moment. Nate felt an uneasy mix of irritation and restraint. "I used the original property survey when I built it," he said evenly. "The measurements are exact. My shed is well within my boundary." Karen gave a small, condescending smile. "Old surveys can be unreliable. The HOA maintains the most recent topographic maps for the subdivision, and they clearly indicate that your fence sits a few feet inside my property line." Her words landed like a slap, though she said them as if she were doing him a favor. Nate stared at her, trying to process the absurdity. "Your property line?" he repeated slowly. "This fence was here long before I moved in. My title deed and the county records confirm it." Karen shrugged. "Then perhaps you should have consulted the HOA before making such an addition. We'll expect confirmation of removal by the end of next week. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining harmony in the neighborhood." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, leaving Nate standing in the middle of his yard, paint drying on his hands, his chest tightening with a dull, slow anger he hadn't felt in years. For the rest of the day, the encounter looped in his mind, refusing to settle. He checked the survey again. The original document signed and sealed by a licensed surveyor just a few months ago when he bought the property. The measurements were precise, the boundary lines clear. His shed was perfectly placed. Yet as the sun dipped behind the trees, he caught sight of Karen again, standing near her back porch, talking to another neighbor and gesturing toward his yard with that same air of authority. He couldn't hear her words, but he didn't need to. He recognized the tone, the way people talk when they've already decided you're guilty of something. That night, Nate sat at his kitchen table, the survey spread before him, the silence of the house pressing down heavier than usual. He thought about his wife, how she used to tell him that some people built walls not to keep others out, but to keep their own power in. As he stared out the window toward the shed, its silhouette framed against the pale moonlight, he realized the peace he'd been chasing had just been challenged, and this time he wasn't sure he'd be able to stay quiet. The following Monday began with an official envelope tucked under Nate's front door, stamped with the HOA's insignia. The neatness of the envelope almost mocked him. The handwriting was elegant, the kind used by people who wanted to remind you they were organized, professional, and above all, in control. Inside was a letter on heavy paper, written in precise legal language that boiled down to a simple ultimatum. Remove the shed within 10 days or face daily fines, enforcement action, and possible litigation for property encroachment. It was signed by Karen Whitfield herself, in the kind of pen stroke that radiated confidence and contempt in equal measure. Nate sat at the kitchen table staring at it, the early sunlight creeping across the counter. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar pulse of frustration that he used to feel working under bureaucratic managers who demanded paperwork for every movement. He took a deep breath, folded the letter neatly, and set it aside. If Karen wanted a fight, she would get one. But he would fight clean, with facts. That afternoon, he drove downtown to the county land records office. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a coffee cup permanently glued to her hand, listened patiently as Nate explained the situation. "You're not the first," she said with a sympathetic sigh. "That HOA's been giving people grief for years. Let's pull up your parcel file." She typed quickly, the screen reflecting in her glasses. Within minutes, she printed the official property plat and handed it to him. "Here's the registered boundary, certified 2 years ago. The fence line is entirely within your lot. Whoever's telling you otherwise is using outdated information or trying to push you." Nate thanked her and asked if she could verify any boundary adjustments. She shook her head. "None recorded. Your property hasn't been altered since the subdivision was first mapped." Driving home, Nate felt a cautious sense of relief, but it was mixed with irritation. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Karen had either made a serious mistake or was deliberately lying. When he pulled into his driveway, he saw her again, standing near her mailbox, talking to another HOA board member, her voice low but animated. Both of them turned slightly when they saw him, then quickly looked away. That was when the first tendrils of unease began to curl in his stomach. This wasn't about a shed. It was about control, and he'd just stepped on the wrong nerve. That evening, he printed copies of his deed, his survey, and the county map. He placed them in a neat folder, labeling it Property Documentation, a small act of order in the chaos that was brewing. He sent an email to Karen and copied the HOA office, attaching digital copies of all the documents. His message was calm, polite, and factual. "The shed sits entirely within my property boundaries as confirmed by official records. No action will be taken to remove it." He expected that to settle things. After all, there was no argument once the legal boundaries were proven. But Karen didn't respond. Not that night, not the next day, not for the rest of the week. Instead, small things began to happen. 2 days later, Nate came home to find an orange notice pinned to his front gate, citing him for non-compliant structure placement. The fine was already listed, $250, with additional penalties accruing daily. He removed it carefully and took a photo for his records. The following morning, his trash bins had been moved from the curb to the middle of his driveway, and one had been tipped over, its contents scattered like an accusation. He told himself it was coincidence. By Thursday, another letter arrived, not from Karen, but from the HOA's Compliance Committee. It accused him of refusing to cooperate with the board and warned that further non-compliance could result in escalated enforcement. The language was so sterile it almost sounded automated, but beneath the formality, Nate could feel Karen's fingerprints all over it. He decided to call the surveyor who had handled his purchase months earlier. The man, a retired engineer named Caldwell, remembered the property immediately. "That lot's solid," he said. "We double-checked the fence line against the original subdivision markers. You've got nothing to worry about." When Nate explained what was happening, Caldwell chuckled, but not out of amusement. "HOAs like to bully. If they can't control you through bylaws, they'll use intimidation. But the map doesn't lie. If you want, I can do a recheck and stamp it again for the record." Nate agreed. 2 days later, Caldwell came out with his equipment, measured everything carefully, and confirmed what Nate already knew. The shed was fully within his property. This time, the surveyor gave him a signed report with a digital timestamp and county verification. "If they try anything, this will shut them down," Caldwell said as he packed up his tools. But it didn't. The very next day, while Nate was working in the backyard, a white SUV pulled up in front of his house. Karen stepped out, flanked by a man in a polo shirt with an HOA badge clipped to his belt. She didn't even bother to knock. She called out to him from the driveway, her tone sharp, businesslike, and cold. "Mr. Blake, we've received your correspondence," she began, holding a folder of papers. "However, your documentation doesn't align with the HOA's current records. Until this is resolved, you're in violation of Community Code Section 14B. Nate straightened slowly, brushing dust from his hands. "I have an official county survey. You're welcome to verify it with the clerk's office." Karen smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We operate under HOA governance, not county oversight. Our boundaries are based on the original community plan, and those supersede private surveys." Her tone was absolute, dismissive. The man beside her said nothing, just nodded as if to punctuate her authority. For a moment, Nate said nothing. He felt the slow burn of anger rising in his chest, not from her words, but from her tone, the easy confidence of someone who had never been questioned, who assumed the rules bent toward her. "You don't have jurisdiction over private property," he said finally. "The HOA governs shared spaces, not privately owned land." Karen's expression hardened. "Mr. Blake, the HOA governs the community, and your property is part of that community. I'm giving you one final opportunity to comply voluntarily. If you continue to defy official directives, we'll have no choice but to take corrective action ourselves." "Meaning what?" he asked, his voice low. She paused, then smiled again. "Meaning, the board may authorize removal of the non-compliant structure at your expense. Have a pleasant afternoon." She turned and walked back to her car, the man trailing obediently behind her. That night, Nate couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt amplified, the wind rattling the fence, the low hum of a passing car, the soft rustle of tree branches. He got up, poured himself a glass of water, and sat by the window, staring at the silhouette of the shed in the darkness. It looked small, harmless, absurdly ordinary. Yet it had become the center of a storm, the symbol of a conflict that was no longer about wood or boundaries, but pride and control. He felt an old, buried instinct stirring inside him, the same one that used to surface when his late wife was being cornered by doctors who spoke in riddles and paperwork, when he had to push through walls of authority to get simple truth. The same resolve returned now. He wasn't going to let this woman, this HOA, strip away what little peace he'd rebuilt. When morning came, he called a property lawyer. The receptionist's voice was calm, professional, practiced. She'd clearly heard stories like his before. "We handle HOA disputes regularly," she said. "You're not alone in this." As Nate described the situation, she listened carefully before transferring him to an attorney named Angela Ruiz. Angela's voice was steady, pragmatic. "Document everything," she advised. "Every letter, every notice, every word exchanged. Don't confront them directly. Communicate only in writing. They thrive on intimidation, not on evidence." Her tone carried quiet confidence, the kind that immediately steadied him. "I've dealt with HOAs like this before. They push until someone pushes back harder. You've done everything right so far. Keep your records clean, and we'll handle the rest." As he ended the call, Nate looked out again toward the shed. The morning light caught its edges, casting long shadows across the grass. He thought of Karen's smile, the quiet malice behind her politeness, and a strange calm settled over him. She thought she could scare him into obedience, but she had misjudged the kind of man he was. Beneath his calm exterior lay the quiet endurance of someone who had already lost everything once and learned that fear only has power when you let it in. The fight had officially begun, and this time Nate Blake wasn't planning to lose. The following week arrived with a silence that didn't feel peaceful, but tense, like the air before a storm. Nate thought perhaps Karen had finally backed down after the lawyer's letter, but deep down, he knew better. The HOA didn't retreat. They regrouped. It was a Tuesday morning when the first sign of their counterattack appeared. A white notice stapled neatly to the fence near his mailbox, the edges laminated to withstand weather, the tone formal and condescending. It declared that, pending verification of property boundaries, his shed was under administrative review, and any modifications to his property were prohibited until further notice. Beneath the printed text was Karen's signature, bold and possessive, as if she were branding his land with her approval. Nate tore it down, folded it carefully, and added it to the growing stack of HOA correspondence he kept in a manila folder marked Evidence. By Thursday, the situation escalated. He came home from a grocery run to find two men standing in his yard. They wore reflective vests with HOA Survey Department printed across the back in cheap vinyl letters. One was holding a clipboard, the other a measuring wheel. They didn't greet him. They simply nodded and kept working, as if he didn't exist. "Can I help you?" Nate asked, his voice calm but firm. The older man barely glanced up. "Official boundary verification, sir. HOA directive." Nate took a step closer, his heartbeat rising. "This is private property. You have no authorization to be here." The younger one smirked, not even stopping the wheel. "We were told to proceed." Nate felt something snap in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but the kind of resolve that comes when you realize someone has crossed the line from nuisance to violation. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and started recording. "Leave my property," he said evenly. The older man hesitated, muttered something under his breath, and after a long pause, they both gathered their tools and left, though not without a final glance that promised this wasn't over. That evening, Karen called. Her voice through the phone was deceptively calm, the tone of someone pretending civility while holding a knife behind her back. "Mr. Blake," she began, "we've received concerning reports that you obstructed HOA personnel during an authorized inspection." Nate almost laughed. "Authorized by who?" "You." "By the board," she replied sharply. "And as president, I have full discretion to ensure compliance with community regulations." "Your people trespassed on my property," he said. "I have it on video. You're exceeding your authority." There was a pause, Not hesitation, but calculation. Mr. Blake, I strongly suggest you reconsider your attitude. Defiance only makes matters worse. Perhaps we can resolve this amicably if you cooperate. Her voice softened slightly, as if she were offering a deal. Move the shed back 20 feet, and I'll have the fines dropped. We can both put this behind us. Her words hung there, dripping with false kindness. No, Nate said simply. The shed stays. You're on the wrong side of the law, and you know it. Karen exhaled, a sharp hiss of frustration before her tone turned icy. Then you're forcing my hand. The line went dead. 2 days later, Nate woke to the sound of hammering. For a brief second, his mind went to construction somewhere nearby, but when he stepped outside, the sound was coming from his side of the fence. He walked toward it and froze. Karen's backyard crew, 3 men in matching shirts labeled Whitfield Contracting, were installing a new fence section that extended nearly 3 feet into his yard. "Hey," he shouted, striding toward them. "Stop what you're doing." One of them turned, his expression indifferent. "Ma'am said to extend the property line. We're just following the order." Nate's pulse spiked. "You're trespassing. You step another inch and I'll call the police." The worker looked uneasy now, glancing toward Karen, who was standing on her patio, arms crossed, watching everything with an expression of smug detachment. "You go ahead and call," she said, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "But make sure you tell them you're interfering with an authorized boundary correction." Nate clenched his fists, every muscle in his body screaming to react, but he forced himself to turn and walk back inside. He didn't call the police immediately. He called Angela, his lawyer. She listened in silence before replying. "They're trying to provoke you. Don't engage directly. I'll file a cease and desist order this afternoon. But you need to document everything. Photos, timestamps, all of it." For the rest of that day, he took pictures. The fence posts, the workers, even Karen watching from her porch like a monarch surveying her territory. By evening, the cease and desist was filed, and Angela had sent formal notice to both Karen and the HOA. But the damage was done. A few of the posts were already cemented into the ground. The next morning, when Nate checked, the workers were gone, leaving behind uneven holes and fresh concrete scars that sliced into his lawn like wounds. The stress began to seep into every corner of his life. The nights grew longer, his sleep broken by small noises. Footsteps on gravel, a car idling too long near the curb. One morning, he found his mailbox open, its contents missing. Another day, someone had thrown soil against his shed wall, staining the paint. Each incident was minor, deniable, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The worst came one night when he heard voices outside around midnight. Peering through the blinds, he saw flashlights flickering along the fence line. He couldn't make out the figures, but he saw the beam pause at the shed before disappearing. The next morning, there were fresh stakes in the ground, thin metal rods with orange flags marking new measurements. They hadn't even tried to hide them. Angela pushed for a temporary injunction, but HOA responded with their own claim, accusing Nate of illegally extending his property line and harassing community officials. They presented manipulated photos, showing the fence at deceptive angles, as if his shed really did cross the boundary. Karen's influence was everywhere. Her friends on the HOA board, her subtle grip on the local inspector, the way official responses arrived days late whenever they worked in Nate's favor. The system was bending around her, protecting her authority. One afternoon, while walking his dog along the sidewalk, Nate overheard 2 neighbors whispering near their driveways. "He's the one fighting the HOA," one said. "Karen told me he built half his stuff on her land." Shame. He seemed nice. They both fell silent when he approached, pretending to check their mail. That was when the real weight of isolation hit him. The HOA didn't just enforce rules. They shaped perception, turning decent people against each other with a few carefully chosen words. But Nate wasn't the kind of man who folded under pressure. He began to gather his own allies quietly. The few neighbors who still believed in fairness, including an elderly veteran named Frank Dorsey, who had lived there for 30 years. When Nate told him what was happening, Frank nodded grimly. "She's been running this place like her own kingdom. I've seen her push 3 families out already. You're the first one who's standing your ground." He handed Nate a yellowed folder, brittle at the edges. Inside was a copy of the original development plan from decades ago, with hand-drawn boundary lines and official stamps. "That's the real layout," Frank said. "And if you compare it to what the HOA is using now, you'll notice something. Her house line shifts east by about 3 feet. Nate stared at the papers, the revelation sinking in. "You mean her property overlaps mine?" Frank gave a slow nod. "Not yours overlapping hers, the other way around." That night, as Nate spread the documents across his table, his anger transformed into something colder, sharper, purpose. For weeks he had been defending himself, reacting to every move they made. Now, he finally had proof that Karen wasn't just mistaken or vindictive. She was guilty of the very thing she accused him of. The balance had shifted, and for the first time since this began, he felt something close to power returning. The HOA wanted a fight. Now they were going to get one, and this time he wouldn't just be defending his shed. He would be exposing their entire lie. The morning of the county hearing arrived gray and heavy, the kind of weather that seemed to soak through your clothes and into your bones. Nate stood in front of the courthouse steps with the folder pressed under his arm, the papers inside worn from use, edges softened from the number of times he'd gone over them, memorizing every line. Angela met him at the entrance, her usual calm giving him a fragile sense of control. "We're not going in to fight," she said quietly, her tone even but firm. "We're going in to show the truth. The moment you lose your temper, you give her the advantage. Let the evidence do the work." He nodded, breathing in the damp air, steadying himself before following her inside. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, a sterile place for something as personal as the battle for a few feet of earth. The room was smaller than he expected, more like a classroom than a courtroom. Karen was already there, perfectly composed in a beige suit, a pearl brooch pinned neatly at her collar, her lips drawn into a faint smile that never reached her eyes. Beside her sat 2 men from the HOA board, one pretending to scroll through his phone, the other organizing a stack of papers with deliberate efficiency. They didn't look up when Nate entered, though Karen did. Briefly, her gaze sharp, cold, satisfied. Angela placed her hand lightly on his arm, a silent warning to stay calm. The county mediator, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the weary patience of someone who had seen too many neighborhood disputes turn vicious, began the session by reminding everyone that the goal was resolution and civility. Karen's smile widened slightly, as if she'd already won. When asked to present her position, she rose smoothly, every word polished and rehearsed. She spoke about community harmony and the importance of abiding by uniform standards. Her tone was soft, but carried the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. She presented her documents, the HOA map, the photos of Nate's shed, the official complaint letters, all neatly arranged, all presented as though she were protecting the sanctity of the neighborhood rather than her own pride. When she finished, she sat down with the air of a queen returning to her throne. Angela stood next, her approach quieter but sharper. She began by distributing copies of the county-certified survey and the original development map Frank had provided. Her words were calm, methodical, but with an undercurrent of steel that made even the mediator glance up. "The property line in question has not changed since the subdivision's original registration," she explained. The HOA's boundary map, introduced by Mrs. Whitfield, reflects unauthorized adjustments not recorded by the county. Independent verification confirms that Mr. Blake's shed is entirely within his property, whereas a section of Mrs. Whitfield's patio and eastern fence extends approximately 3 feet beyond her lawful boundary. Karen's expression didn't falter, but her posture stiffened, her fingers curling slightly around her pen. "That's absurd," she said quickly, before the mediator could respond. "That document is decades old, and whatever copy they've dug up is irrelevant to current zoning. The HOA's updated map reflects the real state of our community as it stands today." Angela didn't blink. "Updated by whom?" she asked. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "By the HOA, in coordination with our committee surveyor." Angela leaned forward slightly. "Was that survey filed with the county?" "It was reviewed internally," Karen replied, her tone tightening. "So, not filed," Angela pressed. The mediator raised a hand gently to calm the exchange, but the damage was already done. The question hung in the air like a small, precise wound that didn't bleed immediately but hurt all the same. For the next hour, the arguments unfolded with painstaking formality. Karen's voice grew sharper, her calm veneer cracking as Angela dismantled each claim with official records, dated photographs, and witness statements. When Angela produced Frank's signed affidavit confirming the original fence positions, Karen snapped, "That man can barely remember what day it is. He's been trying to undermine the board for years." The mediator looked up, frowning. "Mrs. Whitfield, please keep your comments respectful." She smiled tightly, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes darted toward Nate with something venomous beneath the surface. When it was Nate's turn to speak, he kept his words simple. He talked about the shed. Not as a legal structure, but as something human. How he had built it himself. How it wasn't just a building, but part of the life he'd been trying to rebuild. "I followed every rule, every permit," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with restrained emotion. "I moved here for peace, not for conflict. I respect my neighbors. But I can't let someone take away what's mine because it suits their ego or their version of order." The mediator nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. When Karen tried to interrupt, he raised his hand again. "You've both been heard," he said. "Now let's discuss resolution." But Karen wasn't finished. "Resolution?" she repeated with a bitter laugh. "You think he's some innocent victim? He's manipulated the system, spread lies about me, and stirred hostility in the community. I've had people questioning my integrity because of his accusations." Her voice rose, shrill now, cracking the carefully curated image she had maintained for years. "That shed is an eyesore, and it violates the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood. If he can just do whatever he wants, then what's the point of the HOA?" The room went quiet. Even her own board members shifted uncomfortably. The mediator exhaled. "Mrs. Whitfield, this hearing concerns property boundaries, not aesthetics. Please stay on topic." The session ended with a decision to conduct an independent survey, ordered by the county. Angela's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. Not victory, but progress. Outside, the sky had darkened, a drizzle beginning to fall, turning the courthouse steps slick and reflective. Karen exited first, her heels clicking furiously against the stone. As she passed Nate, she didn't look at him directly, but her words slipped out low and sharp enough for only him to hear. "You've made a mistake coming after me. You think you've won something today, but you don't know who you're dealing with." Then she walked away, the scent of her perfume lingering like smoke. For a moment, Nate just stood there, watching the rain bead against the sidewalk. Angela joined him, adjusting the folder in her arms. "She's not going to let this go," he said quietly. Angela gave a humorless laugh. "No, people like her never do, but she's losing her grip." You saw it in there. She's not used to being challenged. He nodded, though the reassurance didn't quite settle the knot in his chest. As they parted ways, he glanced back at the courthouse one last time. For weeks, he had been reacting to her moves, always on the defensive. But now the tide was shifting. The truth was out, and Karen's calm facade had cracked for everyone to see. Over the next few days, small ripples began to spread through the neighborhood. 2 of the HOA board members quietly resigned, citing personal reasons. Neighbors who had avoided Nate began greeting him again, cautiously but sincerely. Word had spread about the hearing, about the fence, about the real boundaries. Karen, however, didn't disappear. She adapted. She started sending group emails accusing Nate of weaponizing false information and endangering the integrity of community governance. A few loyal supporters echoed her words, but most stayed silent. Her power was slipping, and she could feel it. Late one night, while Nate was finishing some paperwork, headlights flashed outside. He looked through the blinds and saw Karen standing in her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, pacing furiously. The faint sound of her voice carried across the still air. "He thinks he's clever," she was saying, "but I'll make him regret it." Then she stopped suddenly, as if sensing she was being watched. Her gaze lifted, meeting his window. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she smiled, slow, deliberate, unblinking, before turning back toward her house. Nate stood there long after she disappeared inside, the silence of the night settling back around him. It wasn't over. The independent survey would take time, and Karen would use every minute of it to twist, stall, and retaliate. But something inside him had changed. He was no longer just defending his property. He was confronting the corruption of a system built on fear and manipulation. She had underestimated him once, mistaking his quiet for weakness. Now she would learn what quiet persistence really looked like. He turned off the lights, the rain starting again outside, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel like a man under siege. He felt like a man preparing for war. The weeks that followed the hearing felt like walking through a minefield where every step carried the threat of an explosion. The independent county surveyors came and went, quiet men with orange vests and patient eyes, measuring, recording, documenting every inch of soil as if the truth were buried in the dirt itself. Nate greeted them politely and kept his distance, though he noticed Karen watching from her porch each time, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze sharp as a blade. He could feel her anger from across the street, the way it radiated like heat, and he knew that the results of the survey would not end the fight, but ignite a new one. When the report finally arrived, it was almost anticlimactic in its clarity. The shed was entirely within Nate's property, while Karen's patio and part of her fence crossed into his by nearly 3 feet. The document was official, stamped, and irrefutable. Angela emailed him a scanned copy with the words, "We've got her cornered. Be ready for retaliation." The retaliation came faster than either of them expected. 2 days later, Nate received another letter from the HOA, this one accusing him of sustained harassment toward board members, deliberate obstruction of HOA operations, and failure to maintain neighborhood decorum. The phrasing was absurdly formal, yet beneath it lay something darker, a threat disguised as bureaucracy. The letter informed him that the HOA had voted to impose a $1,000 fine and suspend his community privileges, which meant, in practice, that he was barred from attending neighborhood meetings or using shared facilities. He laughed bitterly when he read it, then placed it on the growing stack in his evidence folder. Angela advised him not to react publicly. "They're flailing," she said during their next call. "They're trying to provoke you into losing control. Stay steady. The court will see through this." But Karen wasn't interested in legal outcomes anymore. She wanted revenge. That weekend, while Nate was mowing the lawn, he noticed 3 unfamiliar faces standing near the edge of his property. They were talking quietly with Karen, pointing toward the shed. One of them, a man with a clipboard, took photos. When Nate approached and asked what was happening, the man smiled blandly and said, "Routine compliance inspection, HOA directive." Nate clenched his jaw. "There's an active injunction against unauthorized entry. You're trespassing." Karen's voice drifted over the fence, cold and confident. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Mr. Blake. We're ensuring community safety. You wouldn't want to be responsible for property violations that could endanger others, would you?" Her words were a deliberate performance for the small crowd of curious neighbors who had gathered nearby. She wanted to humiliate him publicly, to make him look unstable. That night, he found his trash cans overturned again, but this time someone had poured paint across the driveway, thick streaks of white that gleamed under the porch light like scars. On his front step lay another notice from the HOA, warning him about improper waste management. It was signed, again, by Karen. The next morning, his internet connection went down, followed by his mailbox being jammed with wet paper. It was relentless, small acts of sabotage that by themselves meant nothing but together created a constant background of pressure. The neighborhood began to fracture around them, some residents openly supporting Karen's version of events, others avoiding her altogether. Children were told not to walk their dogs near Nate's property. Cars slowed as they passed his house, the drivers pretending to check their mirrors while clearly staring. The situation turned when Angela forwarded Nate a series of leaked emails that had surfaced anonymously. Correspondence between Karen and a contractor she frequently hired. The messages detailed plans for land boundary adjustment projects across the community, most of which involved properties adjacent to hers or those of her allies on the board. The tone of the emails was casual, even cheerful, but the content was damning. Karen had knowingly authorized fence extensions and patio constructions that encroached on neighboring lots, all while accusing others of violations to deflect suspicion. "This is fraud," Angela said bluntly when they met to review the evidence. "And it's not just civil. She's altered property boundaries without consent or permits. If we present this, the HOA goes down with her." Nate listened quietly, his hands resting on the table. "So we take it to court?" he asked. Angela nodded. "Yes, but we need one more piece. Direct evidence linking her to the falsified maps. If we can prove she ordered them herself, it's over." Nate knew exactly where to find it. That evening, he drove to the HOA office, a small, sterile building at the edge of the subdivision. The windows were dark, the parking lot empty. Using his phone's flashlight, he peered through the glass and saw rows of filing cabinets against the back wall. He wasn't planning to break in. Not yet. But he needed to understand what he was up against. As he stood there, a car pulled into the lot. Karen stepped out, her expression momentarily startled before hardening into disdain. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Blake," she said, her voice low and tight. "You're not allowed on HOA property." "Neither are your falsified documents," he replied evenly. "How many people have you lied to, Karen? How many homes did you push back just so yours could grow?" She took a step closer, her heels echoing in the stillness. "You're making a very serious mistake. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just another man who doesn't understand how things work. The HOA is the law here. We set the standards. We keep order." Her tone cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the fear beneath the arrogance. Nate met her gaze without blinking. "No, Karen, you keep control. There's a difference." The standoff ended when she turned abruptly, unlocking the office door and slamming it shut behind her. Through the window, he saw her pulling a box from one of the cabinets, her movements hurried, almost frantic. The next morning, Angela received an anonymous package containing photocopies of several HOA internal memos, the same box Nate had seen in Karen's hands. The memos confirmed everything. Karen had authorized revisions to multiple property maps, using an unlicensed surveyor paid off through an administrative expense account. The trail led directly to her signature. "Someone inside the HOA wants her gone," Angela said, scanning the documents. "She's losing her grip." By the end of that week, the county court issued a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from taking any enforcement actions against Nate until the full case could be heard. It should have been a victory, but the next night, Nate woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside his house. He looked through the window and saw a pickup truck idling by the shed. Two figures jumped out, one carrying a sledgehammer. Before he could react, the hammer struck the shed wall with a heavy, hollow crack. Nate ran outside, shouting, but the men fled, the truck's taillights vanishing into the darkness. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but the message was unmistakable. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. It was war. He stood there in the cold, breath visible in the air, his fists trembling not from fear, but from the exhaustion of constant defense. The shed stood scarred but upright, defiant, a mirror of his own endurance. The next morning, police arrived, took statements, and left without promises. "Probably kids," one officer muttered, scribbling notes. Nate watched the patrol car drive away, realizing that the system Karen had manipulated so easily was now too indifferent to protect him. But he wasn't alone anymore. Neighbors began stopping by quietly, offering words of support, some even sharing their own experiences of harassment. One of them, a young couple, handed him a flash drive containing recordings from their doorbell camera. Footage showing the same truck idling near Karen's house an hour before the vandalism. It was proof, not just of her involvement, but of her desperation. That night, Nate sat on his porch, the cool wind rustling through the trees, and watched the light in Karen's window flicker before going dark. He no longer saw her as a neighbor or even an enemy. She was something else entirely, a woman so consumed by power that she had built a world of rules only she could break. The fear that once lingered at the edges of his thoughts was gone, replaced by a grim clarity. This was no longer about a shed or a fence. It was about the right to stand on your own ground when everyone else tells you to move. And for the first time, Nate realized he wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to end it. The courtroom was filled with that heavy, stagnant air that seemed to carry the weight of everything unspoken. Resentment, pride, fear. Nate sat quietly beside Angela at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the polished floor that reflected the morning light. Across from him sat Karen, immaculate as always, though something in her posture betrayed her. The perfect composure she once wore like armor had begun to crack, her lips pressed too tightly together, her eyes flickering with the uneasy awareness that control was slipping from her grasp. The county judge, a stern woman with silver hair and a voice that cut through the murmurs like a blade, called the case to order. The official title sounded clinical: Blake versus Whitfield and the Homeowners Association of Oak Ridge Estates. But to Nate, it was far simpler. It was the moment when truth would finally be louder than manipulation. Angela began with quiet precision, her words carrying no drama, only the calm certainty of fact. She presented the certified survey results, the original subdivision maps, the photographs of the fence encroachment, and the internal HOA memos signed by Karen herself. Each piece landed like a steady hammer strike, unhurried but devastating. When she projected the emails on the courtroom screen, the ones detailing Karen's boundary adjustments and off-the-record payments, the room shifted. The board members seated behind Karen exchanged uneasy glances. One of them leaned back, whispering something that made another's jaw tighten. Angela finished her presentation not with a flourish, but with a line so simple it cut through the legal language. The defendant weaponized authority for personal gain. My client built a shed within his rights. What Mrs. Whitfield built was an illusion of power. When it was Karen's turn, she rose from her seat with the brittle energy of someone who had spent too long pretending not to be afraid. Her voice was sharper than usual, her tone defensive but cloaked in righteousness. "This isn't about power," she began. "It's about maintaining the integrity of our community. Mr. Blake's behavior has been disruptive and aggressive. He's made false accusations, spread lies, and tried to turn neighbors against each other. As president of the HOA, I acted to preserve harmony." The judge's gaze remained unmoved, her pen scratching notes slowly, rhythmically. Angela waited until Karen was halfway through her monologue before interrupting gently, her tone almost polite. "Mrs. Whitfield, could you clarify something for the record? Did you, or did you not, authorize boundary modifications without filing them with the county?" Karen hesitated, her breath catching. "Those were administrative adjustments," she said quickly. "Not legal filings. It was standard procedure." "Standard procedure for who?" Angela asked softly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the turning point, the moment the entire room seemed to lean forward as Angela produced one final document. "This," she said, "is a sworn statement from a member of your own board, Mrs. Whitfield. It confirms that you instructed him to approve internal maps without county verification." She let the words hang in the air before adding, "The same maps used to accuse my client of trespassing." The judge took the document, read it slowly, and then lifted her gaze to Karen. "Is this true?" she asked, her tone calm but unmistakably heavy. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she didn't have a ready answer. "Your Honor," she began, "I was misinformed. I acted under the impression that the law didn't apply to you." The judge interrupted, her voice still measured but now cutting. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Karen's face flushed. When Nate was called to testify, he spoke simply. He didn't grandstand or accuse. He described the months of harassment, the sleepless nights, the vandalism, and the sense of isolation. His voice wavered only once, when he mentioned his late wife. "She used to tell me that peace is something you build piece by piece," he said quietly. "I tried to do that here, but someone decided that peace was a privilege, not a right." Even the judge's expression softened for a moment before she regained her composure. Karen's lawyer tried to cross-examine, but each attempt faltered against the weight of the evidence already laid bare. The truth didn't need dramatics. It stood on its own. By the time closing arguments ended, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. The tension that once surrounded Karen had dissipated, leaving her small, exposed, her authority evaporated like smoke. The judge's verdict came swiftly. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," she said, her tone steady but unmistakably final. "The shed in question lies entirely within Mr. Blake's property, while a portion of the defendant's structure encroaches beyond her boundary. The Homeowners Association's fines and actions against Mr. Blake are nullified, and all related claims are dismissed. Additionally, the court orders the removal of the encroaching patio structure and the reimbursement of legal fees to the plaintiff. Furthermore, an investigation into the HOA's administrative conduct will be referred to the County Ethics Board." The gavel came down once, a sound both abrupt and absolute. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her eyes glassy but dry. Then, without a word, she gathered her papers and walked out, her heels clicking mechanically against the tile. The board members followed at a distance, avoiding her gaze. Nate didn't move right away. He sat still, letting the moment sink in. It wasn't triumph, he felt. It was something quieter, heavier, like relief edged with exhaustion. Angela touched his shoulder lightly. "It's over," she said. He nodded, though deep down he knew it wasn't really over. Nothing that had dragged him through so much could end with a single sound of a gavel. But justice had been spoken aloud, and that, for now, was enough. Outside, the sky had cleared, the afternoon light breaking through the clouds in pale gold streaks. Reporters were waiting near the steps, their voices hushed, unsure whether this small neighborhood dispute warranted attention. Nate ignored them and walked to his truck, the faint breeze carrying the scent of rain and the echo of Karen's footsteps fading behind him. He looked back only once, just long enough to see her standing near her car, speaking sharply into her phone, her gestures frantic and uncontrolled, the gestures of someone who no longer had anyone listening. For the first time since it began, Nate allowed himself a small, tired smile. Not one of victory, but of peace reclaimed, fragile and real. When he returned home, the shed stood waiting in the same quiet corner of the yard, untouched by time or malice. He ran his hand across its wooden frame, the surface rough beneath his fingertips, grounding him in something tangible. The fight had taken months, cost him sleep, patience, and faith in simple decency, but as he stood there in the soft evening light, he understood what the whole battle had been about. It wasn't land or law or property lines. It was the right to belong, to exist without permission, to build something honest in a world ruled by pettiness. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence around his home felt like peace again. The weeks after the trial unfolded with a strange, cautious stillness, as if the entire neighborhood were holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. The HOA board met twice behind closed doors, though this time the minutes of their meetings were made public, a court mandate that stripped away their secrecy. Karen's name disappeared from the official documents. She had resigned for personal reasons, though everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. Her house, once the symbol of order and authority, now stood quiet, blinds drawn, the yard overgrown. Sometimes Nate saw her car in the driveway, but never her face. Word spread that she was moving, selling the property through an agent from another county. The whispers that followed her departure were not cruel, just subdued, the way people speak about something that had once seemed unshakable, but had quietly collapsed under its own weight. For Nate, life didn't return to what it had been. It became something better. The same neighbors who had once avoided him now stopped to chat on evening walks, dropping off baked bread or asking him to help check their property paperwork. A few of them even joined together to form a new HOA committee, this one transparent and accountable, led by Frank, the old veteran whose calm voice carried more respect than Karen's threats ever had. When they asked Nate to participate, he hesitated at first, weary of bureaucracy, but eventually accepted, not out of ambition, but out of a sense of duty. He knew that silence and passivity had allowed people like Karen to thrive. Now, he wanted to ensure that no one else would have to fight the same battle. One Saturday morning, as sunlight stretched across the yard, Nate repainted the shed door a deep, warm red, the color his wife had once chosen for their old home years ago. He fixed the small birdhouse she'd started building, placing it on the roof beam, a quiet tribute to what he had lost and regained. The shed no longer felt like a point of conflict. It was a reminder of resilience, of the simple truth that some spaces are worth defending no matter the cost. The sound of children's laughter drifted from down the street, the kind of easy, careless noise that used to make him feel isolated but now only brought peace. When evening came, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the soft glow of porch lights flicker on one by one. The air smelled of cut grass and rain, and the neighborhood, once fractured by tension, felt whole again. He thought about how fragile order could be, how easily rules turned into weapons in the wrong hands, and how power, when left unchecked, corroded even the people who believed they were using it for good. But he also thought about something Angela had said after the verdict. that justice wasn't about punishment, but restoration. Looking out at the calm street, he finally understood what she meant. Justice wasn't the sound of the gavel. It was this: the quiet, steady heartbeat of a community learning to breathe again.